Three armed bikers strutted into a small corner store looking for easy cash. They found a former Force Recon Marine who'd spent 15 years hunting high-value targets in the world's deadliest combat zones. What happened next would expose a massive auto theft operation, bring down an international crime syndicate, and teach the Iron Scorpion's motorcycle gang a brutal lesson about judging books by their covers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how three small-time criminals made the biggest mistake of their lives, and how their failed robbery attempt would uncover a criminal empire that had been growing unchecked for years in the shadows of America's quiet suburban neighborhoods. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one carrying the biggest gun. It's the unassuming shopkeeper who knows exactly how many steps it takes to reach you, and who's already planned 3 different ways to put you down before you even walked through the door. Before we dive deeper into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment below. And if you're enjoying these true crime stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's episode reveals how a cartel's million-dollar mistake led to their ultimate downfall. Mike Anderson never wanted any more excitement in his life. After 15 years as a Force Recon Marine, including multiple classified operations and more close calls than he cared to remember, he'd bought this small convenience store in the quiet suburb of Pine Valley for one simple reason: peace and quiet. The store's location, tucked away in a peaceful residential area just outside Detroit, suited him perfectly. It was just busy enough to be profitable, but quiet enough to let him ease back into civilian life. Running his store helped quiet the memories that still haunted him, the missions that went sideways, the friends he'd lost, the things he'd seen that no one should have to see. His regular customers knew him as the friendly, soft-spoken guy who always had a kind word and never seemed to get rattled, no matter how hectic things got. None of them knew about the scars hidden beneath his casual clothing, or why he always positioned himself where he could see both entrances and all approaches to the counter. What they also didn't know was that Mike had noticed something odd lately. More expensive cars showing up in this middle-class neighborhood, new faces that didn't quite fit, and most concerning, a steady increase in motorcycle traffic, specifically bikes carrying the Iron Scorpion's distinctive blood-red emblem. Something was changing in Pine Valley, and Mike's finely tuned instincts told him it wasn't for the better. He'd mentioned his concerns to Detective Sarah Chen, a regular customer who'd become something of a friend over the past year. She'd confirmed his suspicions. Property crimes were up, but oddly, official reports were down. It was as if people were becoming afraid to report incidents. The local police seemed strangely hesitant to investigate certain areas or follow up on specific leads. Mike had seen this pattern before, in villages and towns across the world where criminal organizations had started to establish control. It always began the same way: subtle pressure, strategic intimidation, and the slow erosion of people's faith in legitimate authority. But Pine Valley was supposed to be different. This quiet suburban community was supposed to be his escape from that world. He was restocking the cooler one quiet Tuesday evening, thinking about these changes, when the bell above the door chimed. 3 men entered, their leather jackets bearing the Iron Scorpion's emblem. Mike noted their positions without seeming to look up. 2 spread out toward the aisles while 1 approached the counter. Their movements were sloppy, unprofessional. These weren't hardened criminals, they were trying too hard to look tough. What they didn't realize was that they had just walked into the carefully organized domain of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. A man who had mentally mapped every angle, every distance, every potential weapon in his store. A man who was about to teach them why some quiet shopkeepers should never be underestimated. Little did these 3 Iron Scorpions know, but their attempted robbery was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose a criminal operation spanning multiple states, reveal corruption at the highest levels of local government, and remind a lot of dangerous people why you should always look carefully at the quiet ones. They just might be the most dangerous people in the room. The night was about to get very interesting indeed. The autumn evening settled over Pine Valley like a heavy blanket, streetlights casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot of Anderson's corner store. The last remnants of sunset painted the sky in deep purples and dark blues, while a light drizzle created halos around the fluorescent signs advertising cigarettes and cold beer. Inside, the gentle hum of refrigeration units provided a steady backdrop to the quiet store. Mike Anderson methodically restocked the energy drink display, his movements efficient and purposeful. Even after 3 years of civilian life, he couldn't shake the habits ingrained by 15 years of military service. His store was organized with the same precision he'd once applied to mission planning. Everything in its place, sight lines clear, escape routes always accessible. The security cameras he'd installed covered every angle, their feeds displaying on a small monitor behind the counter that he checked with practiced regularity. The store's layout was no accident. He'd designed it himself, positioning the aisles to funnel foot traffic naturally past his counter, ensuring no one could approach without being seen. The mirrors mounted in the corners weren't just for catching shoplifters. They eliminated blind spots, giving him a complete view of his domain. Old habits die hard, and some habits had kept him alive too many times to discard. Tonight felt different, though. The air held a tension he recognized from his days in the service. The calm before a storm, the weighted silence before an ambush. He'd noticed more Iron Scorpion's bikes rumbling past his store lately, their riders watching a little too intently. The gang had been expanding their presence in Pine Valley over the past few months, starting with the industrial district on the edge of town and gradually working their way into the residential areas. Through his front windows, Mike watched an expensive black SUV cruise past for the third time in an hour, its tinted windows hiding the occupants. Not local. The vehicle was too clean for Detroit's autumn weather, and the out-of-state plates caught his eye. Another sign that something bigger was brewing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Detective Chen. "Heads up. Major police callback tonight. Most units being pulled to the other side of town for a training exercise. Stay alert." The message confirmed what his instincts had been telling him. In his experience, when law enforcement suddenly cleared out of an area, it usually meant someone had been paid to look the other way. He'd seen it in a dozen countries, the same patterns, different uniforms. The quiet store suddenly felt more like a combat outpost in hostile territory. Mrs. Martinez, a regular who ran the flower shop 2 doors down, hurried in just before closing time. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by nervous energy as she grabbed a few items. "Be careful tonight, Mr. Anderson," she whispered at the counter, glancing over her shoulder. Those motorcycle men, they were asking questions about the store owners in the area, about who might cause trouble. Mike nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Thanks for the warning, Mrs. Martinez. You should head straight home tonight." He watched through the windows as she hurried to her car, making sure she pulled away safely. The interaction added another piece to the puzzle he'd been assembling. The Iron Scorpions were gathering intelligence, preparing for something. In his experience, criminal organizations didn't ask questions about local businesses unless they were planning to make moves against them. He did one final walkthrough of the store, checking the locks on the back door and ensuring the silent alarm was armed. The baseball bat behind the counter wasn't his only defense. He had other measures in place, carefully concealed but readily accessible. Not because he was paranoid, but because experience had taught him that preparation often meant the difference between life and death. The drizzle outside had intensified into a steady rain, drums against the metal awning over the entrance. The streetlight nearest his store flickered once, then went dark. Not a coincidence. He'd seen this tactic before. Reduce visibility, create shadows, make the target nervous. Amateur moves, but effective against ordinary shopkeepers. Too bad he was anything but ordinary. Through the rain-streaked windows, he caught the gleam of chrome as 3 motorcycles pulled into his lot, their engines deliberately loud in the quiet evening. The riders took their time dismounting, adjusting their leather jackets bearing the Iron Scorpion's emblem. Their movements betrayed their intentions. The way they spread out, how they scanned the area, the bulges in their jackets that suggested concealed weapons. Mike continued his closing routine as if he hadn't noticed them, but his mind was already racing through scenarios, calculating angles, identifying potential weapons and cover. The skills that had kept him alive through countless operations were sliding back into place, as natural as breathing. These men thought they were walking into a simple robbery. Instead, They were stepping into carefully prepared territory, facing an opponent they were drastically underestimating. The bell above the door was about to chime, and with it, the quiet evening would erupt into something these would-be robbers never anticipated. Sometimes the best ambush is the one your target walks into willingly, thinking they're the predator when they're actually the prey. To the three iron scorpions swaggering through his door, Mike Anderson probably looked like any other middle-aged shopkeeper. Average height, graying at the temples, wearing a faded Detroit Tigers baseball cap and a well-worn flannel shirt. The kind of man who'd spent his life stocking shelves and counting change, who might tremble at the sight of their gang patches and concealed weapons. They couldn't see the scars beneath his casual clothing, couldn't read the combat experience in his steady gaze, and certainly couldn't guess at the things he'd done in service to his country. Old Tom Parker, who ran the auto repair shop next door, was one of the few who knew fragments of Mike's past. He'd caught a glimpse of the elaborate tattoo on Mike's forearm one hot summer day. The Force Recon emblem intertwined with dates and coordinates that told stories of far-off battles. "You don't forget eyes like that," Tom had told his wife later. "The kind that have seen too much, that stay alert even when the body's at rest." The store itself reflected its owner's complex nature. On the surface, it was meticulously organized, shelves perfectly stocked, floors spotlessly clean, everything in its proper place. But there were subtle details that hinted at something more. The slightly reinforced counter that could serve as cover, the strategic placement of heavy display cases that could become barriers, the extra lighting that eliminated shadows where threats could hide. Mike had chosen this location carefully 3 years ago when he'd left the Marines. Pine Valley was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place to quiet the memories that still woke him in the dead of night, the whisper of bullets in Fallujah, the explosion that took his best friend in Kandahar, the classified operations that would never make the history books. The store was meant to be his therapy, a way to serve his community in peace rather than war. Detective Sarah Chen had been one of his first regular customers, stopping by each morning for coffee and gradually becoming something of a confidant. She'd recognized something familiar in his bearing. Her father had been Special Forces, and she'd grown up learning to spot the tells. Over time, they'd developed an unofficial arrangement. She kept him informed about criminal activities in the area, and he served as an extra set of eyes on the street, noting suspicious patterns and unfamiliar faces. Lately, those patterns had been troubling. The Iron Scorpions weren't just another motorcycle gang causing trouble. Their expansion into Pine Valley felt coordinated, professional. Mike had noticed their members photographing buildings, timing police patrols, marking territories. They operated with a discipline that suggested military training, or at least professional criminal experience. His concerns had deepened last week when he'd overheard 2 of them discussing shipment schedules and VIN numbers. The conversation had triggered memories of an operation he'd been part of years ago, tracking an international auto theft ring that had been feeding stolen luxury vehicles to overseas buyers. The patterns were too similar to be coincidence. The regulars who frequented his store had started sharing worried whispers. Mrs. Martinez from the flower shop reported intimidation of local business owners. Jim Chen, who ran the pharmacy down the street, mentioned pressure to participate in new business opportunities. Even Tom Parker had received visits about using his auto shop for additional services. What troubled Mike most was the lack of official response. Detective Chen had confided that her investigations kept hitting dead ends. Evidence disappeared from the evidence room. Witnesses suddenly became uncooperative. Surveillance footage went missing. Someone in the department was clearly on the gang's payroll, but the corruption went deeper than just a few crooked cops. The store had become more than just a business to Mike. It was his observation post, his forward operating base in what was increasingly feeling like occupied territory. He'd started keeping a log of suspicious activities, noting license plates, photographing unfamiliar faces, mapping out the gang's patterns of movement. Old habits from his intelligence-gathering days that were proving increasingly relevant. His military training had taught him to read people, to spot the subtle signs of impending violence. The 3 Iron Scorpions who'd just entered his store were broadcasting their intentions clearly. The way they spread out, their exaggerated confidence, the nervous energy that suggested this might be their first armed robbery. They were soldiers too, in their own way, probably sent to test his resolve, to see if he'd bow to intimidation like the others. What they didn't realize was that they weren't dealing with just another shopkeeper. Behind his calm exterior, Mike's mind was already racing through scenarios, identifying threats, calculating angles of attack and escape routes. The quiet man in the baseball cap was actually a highly trained combat veteran who'd spent years in situations far more dangerous than this. They were about to learn a harsh lesson about appearances, about the dangers of underestimating quiet men in quiet places. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making threats. It's the one who's seen enough real violence to know exactly how this is going to end. The lead biker swaggered up to the counter, his leather jacket creaking with each step. The blood-red scorpion emblem on his back seemed to writhe in the fluorescent lighting. "Nice little store you got here, Pops," he sneered, running a gloved hand across the spotless counter. His two companions spread out, one moving toward the drink coolers, the other lingering near the snack aisle. Their movements were meant to look casual but betrayed their inexperience. Too deliberate, too theatrical. Mike continued organizing the cigarette display behind the counter, his movements unhurried. He noted their positions without seeming to look. The leader, probably mid-20s, carried a pistol in a shoulder holster poorly concealed by his jacket. The one by the coolers had something tucked in his waistband. Revolver, based on the outline. The third kept his right hand in his jacket pocket, probably gripping a weapon. His weight shifted forward like he was ready to pounce. "We're closing soon," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying the same calm tone he'd used during countless high-stakes encounters. "Anything specific you're looking for?" The leader, Mike mentally tagged him as Scorpion 1, leaned forward, placing both hands on the counter. A silver ring glinted on his right hand, shaped like a coiled serpent. "Yeah, actually. The Iron Scorpions are expanding our business interests in Pine Valley. We're offering local shops our special protection services. Insurance, you might say, against unfortunate accidents." Through the store's front windows, Mike spotted two more motorcycles pulling up, their riders staying mounted, engines idling. Standard intimidation tactic. Show the target they're outnumbered, hint at reinforcements nearby. He'd seen it used in a dozen countries, though usually with more skill than this amateur display. "That's thoughtful," Mike replied, still organizing his display. "But I already have insurance, good coverage too." His hands moved methodically, but his mind was mapping their positions, calculating distances, identifying potential weapons within reach. The baseball bat behind the counter, the heavy flashlight under the register, the box cutter in his pocket. Scorpion 1's fake smile faltered. "Maybe you don't understand. See? Things happen in this neighborhood. Fires, break-ins, accidents. But businesses under our protection, they don't have those problems. $200 a week, that's all we're asking. Cheap price for peace of mind." The bell above the door chimed again as a regular customer, Jerry, an off-duty paramedic who often stopped by for late-night coffee, started to enter. He froze when he saw the scene unfolding. Mike caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. Jerry backed out slowly, the bell chiming again as the door closed. "Price of doing business," the biker by the coolers added, his voice carrying a nervous edge that betrayed his inexperience. "Every other shop on this street's already signed up." He was lying. Mrs. Martinez would have mentioned if they'd started demanding protection money. This was a test run, probably their first attempt at extortion. Mike finally turned to face them fully, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I appreciate the offer," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an undertone that made Scorpion 1 straighten slightly. "But I'll have to decline." The leader's face darkened. "Wrong answer, old man. We're not asking." His hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Mike was already assessing his next moves. The threat of violence hung in the air like static before a storm, that familiar tension he'd felt countless times before combat was engaged. $300 a week, Scorpion 1 spat, trying to maintain his intimidating facade. "That's our final offer. Otherwise—" He let the threat hang in the air, probably thinking the unfinished sentence made him sound more menacing. Mike noticed the security camera's red light blinking steadily in the corner. Everything was being recorded, just as he'd planned. Detective Chen would need this evidence later. Through the windows, he could see Jerry in the parking lot, phone to his ear, probably calling the police. But given Chen's warning about tonight's training exercise, help wouldn't arrive in time. The third biker, still fidgeting with something in his pocket, moved closer to the counter. "Boss said to make an example if necessary," he said, trying to sound tough but coming across as eager, dangerous in his inexperience. "Show the whole neighborhood what happens when people don't appreciate our protection." They thought they were in control, thought they had a helpless shopkeeper cornered. They couldn't see that they'd walked into a carefully prepared position, facing an opponent who had spent years mastering the art of close-quarters combat. They didn't realize that their target had already identified 6 different ways to neutralize them, had already noted their weaknesses, had already prepared for this exact scenario. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mike made his decision. Sometimes the best way to handle a situation was to let it play out, to give potential enemies enough rope to hang themselves. These 3 were about to learn why some quiet shopkeepers should never be underestimated. "Well then," Mike said softly, his voice carrying the same tone he'd used before some of his most decisive military operations. "I guess we should discuss this further." "I'll give you one chance," Mike said quietly, his hands resting loosely on the counter. "Walk out now, get on your bikes, and we'll forget this happened." His voice remained calm, but something in his tone made Scorpion 1 hesitate for a fraction of a second. The leader recovered quickly, pulling his pistol from its shoulder holster with exaggerated flair. "Tough guy, huh? Maybe we need to educate you about respect." His companions drew their weapons as well, their movements betraying their nervousness. The one by the coolers nearly fumbled his revolver. Mike didn't flinch at the displayed weapons. Instead, he let a slight smile cross his face, the same expression his teammates used to call his combat grin. In one smooth motion, he reached down as if going for the register. "That's right, old man," Scorpion 1 sneered. "Empty the register too. Consider it your first protection payment." What happened next occurred so quickly that the security cameras barely captured it all. Mike's hand didn't go to the register. Instead, he grabbed the heavy flashlight concealed beneath the counter. In one fluid motion born from years of close-quarters combat training, he swung it upward, catching Scorpion 1's gun hand with devastating precision. The pistol clattered to the counter as the leader howled in pain, stumbling backward. Before his companions could react, Mike was already moving. He vaulted over the counter with a grace that shocked the would-be robbers, his body operating on muscle memory honed through countless combat operations. The biker by the coolers managed to get off one wild shot that shattered a bottle of soda, but Mike was already inside his firing arc. A quick strike to the solar plexus doubled the man over, followed by an elbow to the base of the skull that sent him crumpling to the floor. The third attacker backed away, his gun hand shaking. "What the fuck?" was all he managed before Mike closed the distance. A swift leg sweep combined with a textbook arm lock had the man disarmed and face down on the spotless tile floor, his arm twisted behind him at an angle that promised broken bones if he struggled. Scorpion 1 had recovered enough to reach for his dropped pistol, but froze when Mike's voice cut through the chaos. "I wouldn't." The leader looked up to find himself staring down the barrel of his own companion's revolver, held with the steady confidence of someone intimately familiar with firearms. What are you?" The leader gasped, cradling his injured hand. "Just a shopkeeper," Mike replied calmly, keeping the weapon trained on the leader while maintaining the hold on the third biker. "One who's seen enough violence to know how to end it quickly." He nodded toward the security cameras. "One who's recording everything." Through the windows, Mike could see the backup bikers already fleeing, their motorcycles roaring into the night. So much for gang loyalty. The whole encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds. Efficient, controlled, decisive, just like his old combat instructors had taught him. "The cops," Scorpion 1 started to threaten, but Mike cut him off. "Won't be here for a while. Convenient training exercise tonight, right? Someone tipped you off, told you it was a good time to start pressuring local businesses. Mike's voice remained conversational, but his eyes were hard. Question is, who gave that order? Because this wasn't your idea. You're just the test run sent to see which businesses would fold under pressure. The leader's eyes widened slightly, a tell that confirmed Mike's suspicion. This wasn't just random, gang activity. The Iron Scorpions were expanding systematically, which meant someone higher up was coordinating their moves. Here's what's going to happen, Mike continued, hearing approaching sirens in the distance. You're going to wait here for the police. You're going to think very carefully about what you tell them because I recorded everything. And you're going to consider that if I can handle 3 armed men this easily, your friends might want to reconsider their expansion plans in Pine Valley. The third biker whimpered as Mike slightly increased pressure on the arm lock. Okay. It was Marcus. Marcus said to hit the stores tonight, said the cops would be busy across town. Shut up, Scorpion 1 hissed, but the damage was done. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Marcus Cross, a name Mike had heard whispered in concerned conversations among his customers. Detective Chen arrived first, taking in the scene with raised eyebrows. Got your hands full tonight, Mike? Just a cleanup in aisle 3, he replied, maintaining his holds until she had the suspects secured. As backup units arrived and the scene was processed, Mike noticed an expensive black SUV watching from across the street, the same one he'd seen earlier. It pulled away smoothly, its occupants having witnessed the entire encounter. This wasn't over, Mike knew. He'd just disrupted someone's carefully laid plans, and they wouldn't take that lightly. But he'd also sent a message. Pine Valley wasn't going to be an easy target, and some quiet shopkeepers were more dangerous than they appeared. What these Iron Scorpions didn't realize was that they'd just started a war they weren't prepared to fight, against an opponent who'd spent years mastering the art of asymmetric warfare. The real battle was just beginning. As Detective Chen led the last handcuffed biker to her patrol car, Mike was already analyzing the evening's implications. The attempted robbery wasn't random. It was too coordinated, too specifically timed to coincide with the police training exercise. The Iron Scorpions were testing the waters, but someone higher up was directing their movements. Want to tell me how a simple shopkeeper took down 3 armed men without breaking a sweat? Chen asked, returning to the store where Mike was calmly sweeping up broken glass from the shattered soda bottle. Lucky, I guess, Mike replied, but then caught her knowing look. Fine. Force Recon, 15 years. Retired 3 years ago. He emptied the dustpan into a trash bag. Though I'm guessing you already knew that. Chen nodded, pulling out her notepad. Did some digging after I noticed how you move. How you always position yourself with clear sight lines. My father was Special Forces. You learned to recognize the signs. She glanced at the security cameras. Need a copy of that footage. Already uploaded to a secure server, Mike said, moving behind the counter to access his computer. Including the conversation where they mentioned Marcus Cross, I'm assuming. Chen's expression tightened. How do you know that name? People talk, especially to quiet shopkeepers who know how to listen. Mike pulled up the footage on his monitor. Cross started appearing in whispered conversations about 6 months ago, around the same time the Iron Scorpions began expanding their presence here. He played the relevant clip, showing the third biker's panicked confession. Chen watched intently, her expression growing more concerned. This is good evidence, but... She hesitated. Cross has connections. High-level ones. Evidence has a way of disappearing when his name comes up. Which is why I have multiple backups, Mike replied. Old habits. He studied Chen's face. There's more you're not telling me. The detective sighed, checking to ensure they were alone. Cross isn't just another gang leader. Ex-military like you, but he went private sector. Built a network combining traditional gang activities with sophisticated auto theft operations. We're talking high-end vehicles, international shipping, clean paperwork. The Iron Scorpions are just his muscle. Mike nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place. The increased motorcycle traffic, the luxury cars appearing in middle-class neighborhoods, the way they've been photographing local businesses and timing police patrols. They're setting up a distribution network. Exactly. They need legitimate businesses as fronts. Local authorities looked the other way. Chen's voice carried frustration. We've been trying to build a case, but someone in the department keeps tipping them off. Tonight's training exercise wasn't exactly subtle. The black SUV that's been watching my store, Mike added. Out-of-state plates too clean for local weather. Cross's people. Probably his advance team. They monitor potential territories before the Iron Scorpions move in. Chen's phone buzzed. She checked it and frowned. Speaking of which, the 3 from tonight are already being bailed out. Someone with deep pockets is moving fast. Mike wasn't surprised. They'll be back. Not them specifically, but others. Cross can't let this go unanswered. It would undermine his whole operation if word got out that a shopkeeper successfully resisted. You should be careful, Chen warned. Cross isn't just another criminal. He's methodical, strategic. He'll have done his homework on you by morning. Good, Mike replied, his voice carrying a calm certainty that made Chen look at him sharply. Let him do his research. Let him learn about my background. Sometimes the best deterrent is letting your opponent know exactly who they're dealing with. He moved to the store's front windows, scanning the street with practiced ease. Cross thinks he's building an empire here, using the same tactics that worked in other towns. Intimidation, corruption, the slow erosion of resistance. But he made a mistake tonight. Yeah, what's that? He sent amateurs to test defenses, which means he doesn't know this territory as well as he thinks. Doesn't know that some quiet shopkeepers have done their own homework. Mike turned back to Chen. I've been mapping their patterns, documenting their movements, building a picture of their operation that might help your investigation. Chen studied him for a long moment. You're not planning to just defend your store, are you? Mike's slight smile was answer enough. Let's just say some habits are hard to break. Running reconnaissance, gathering intelligence, identifying vulnerabilities. It's like riding a bike. Or in this case, like tracking a motorcycle gang that's about to learn why they should have researched their targets more carefully. The detective shook her head, but there was a glimmer of hope in her expression. Be careful, Mike. Cross isn't someone to underestimate. Neither am I, Mike replied quietly. And unlike Cross, I've got nothing to lose. Just a small store, a quiet life, and a community worth protecting. As Chen left, Mike began his closing routine, but his mind was already planning ahead. Cross would make his next move soon, probably something designed to remind the neighborhood of his power. But he didn't realize that tonight's failed robbery had shifted the balance. The quiet shopkeeper had shown his capabilities, and now the real game could begin. Sometimes, Mike reflected, the best way to win a war is to let your enemy think they're still in control, right up until the moment they realize they've been outmaneuvered from the start. The morning after the attempted robbery, Mike's store became an unexpected hub of community activity. Word had spread quickly through Pine Valley about how the quiet shopkeeper had handled 3 armed bikers. Mrs. Martinez arrived first, bringing fresh coffee and homemade empanadas. My Carlos saw everything from across the street, she said, arranging the food on the counter. He said you move like something from an action movie. Her expression grew serious. But the Iron Scorpions, they don't forget such things. They'll be back. Let them come, Mike replied, accepting the coffee. But tell Carlos he should be careful about what he shares. The fewer people who know details, the better. Tom Parker from the auto shop was next, his weathered face creased with concern. Heard what happened? Listen, I've got some security cameras I never installed. Military-grade stuff from my son's company. They're yours if you want them. Mike recognized the offer for what it was, not just equipment, but alliance. Thanks, Tom. Could use help installing them too. Extra eyes never hurt. The old mechanic nodded, understanding the subtext. They were in this together now. Detective Chen arrived mid-morning, out of uniform but carrying her badge. She wasn't alone. With her was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose bearing screamed military. Mike, meet James Reynolds, Chen said after ensuring the store was empty. Former Army Rangers, now runs a private security firm in Detroit. And more importantly, he's been building a case against Cross for the past year. Reynolds extended his hand. Heard how you handled those 3 last night. Clean, efficient, professional. His grip was firm, his assessment tactical. Not many Force Recon guys running convenience stores. Not many Rangers running security firms, Mike countered, reading the same military awareness in Reynolds' stance. But I'm guessing that's not why you're here. Cross isn't just running auto theft operations, Reynolds explained, spreading photos across the counter. He's building a network, uses the Iron Scorpions to establish control of an area, then sets up legitimate businesses as fronts. Auto shops for processing stolen vehicles, transport companies for moving them, local officials paid to look the other way. Mike studied the photos, surveillance shots of Cross meeting with various officials, documentation of vehicle shipments, maps marking territories under Iron Scorpion control. You've done your homework. Been tracking him since he moved into Detroit, Reynolds confirmed. He's smart, methodical. Military background gives him an edge most gangs don't have. But Pine Valley's different. He's getting aggressive, moving too fast. Because something's pushed his timeline, Chen added. We think he's got a major operation planned, something big enough that he needs this territory secured quickly. The bell chimed as Jim Chen from the pharmacy entered, followed by several other local business owners. Mike had called this meeting, knowing it was time to build a proper network. Everyone here has been pressured by the Iron Scorpions, Mike addressed the group. They're working for a man named Marcus Cross, who's using them to set up an international auto theft operation. But they only have power if we let them intimidate us individually. The business owners shared nervous looks. Easy for you to say, Jim Chen spoke up. We all heard what you did last night. But we're not ex-military, we can't fight back like that. No, Mike agreed. But you can fight smart. Security cameras, detailed records, reporting everything to Detective Chen no matter how small. Building a case that even corrupt officials can't ignore. Reynolds stepped forward. My firm can provide security consultations, help coordinate protection. We've dealt with Cross before. He's dangerous, but not invincible. What about retaliation? Mrs. Martinez asked. They'll come after our families. Not if we stand together, Mike replied. Cross's operation relies on isolating targets, making each business feel alone. But united? He gestured around the store. We can create a network he can't easily break. The meeting continued, plans taking shape. Reynolds would provide security expertise and manpower. Chen would work official channels, coordinating with clean cops. Local businesses would share information, watch each other's backs. And Mike's store would serve as their command center, the last place Cross would expect to find organized resistance. As the others left, Reynolds lingered. You're painting a target on yourself, he warned. Cross will figure out you're the linchpin. Good, Mike replied, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who'd faced worse odds. Let him focus on me. While he's watching the quiet shopkeeper, he might miss the network being built right under his nose. Chen's phone buzzed. Speaking of Cross, she said, checking the message. My source says he's called a meeting with the Iron Scorpion's leadership. Tonight. Apparently someone's head is going to roll for last night's failure. They'll try something soon, Reynolds predicted. Cross can't let this challenge go unanswered. Mike nodded, already thinking ahead. Then we better be ready. Because next time they won't send amateurs, they'll send professionals. You sure about this? Chen asked. Once we start, there's no going back. Mike looked around his store. Not just a business anymore, but a fortress, a command center, a rallying point for a community tired of being afraid. Sometimes, he said quietly, the best way to honor old oaths is to take new ones. I swore to protect this country. This community is part of that. The wheels were in motion now. Cross had unknowingly awakened something he couldn't control. Not just one ex-Marine, but an entire community ready to fight back. The quiet shopkeeper was about to show him why some battles are lost before they even begin. 2 days after the failed robbery attempt, Mike sat in his back office reviewing surveillance footage from cameras Tom had helped install. The Iron Scorpions had been suspiciously quiet, but their presence in Pine Valley had increased. New faces wearing their colors appeared daily, watching businesses, marking territories. His phone buzzed, a message from Reynolds. Intel confirmed. Cross arriving tonight. Meeting at the old steel mill. Bringing heavy hitters from Detroit. Mike had spent the past 48 hours coordinating with his growing network. Mrs. Martinez's flower shop provided perfect cover for observing Iron Scorpion movements. Tom's auto shop employees reported suspicious vehicles arriving at odd hours. Jim Chen's pharmacy staff documented unfamiliar faces asking about delivery schedules. Detective Chen entered through the back door, carrying a thick file. "You need to see this," she said, spreading documents across his desk. "Remember that black SUV? Ran the plates through some unofficial channels. Registered to a shell company linked to Cross's operation." Mike studied the documents: vehicle registrations, property records, financial statements. A pattern emerged, one he'd seen before in his military days tracking criminal networks. They're setting up infrastructure, he noted. These property purchases all strategic locations near highways, storage facilities, industrial areas. Gets better, Chen added, pulling out more papers. Cross's operation isn't just about auto theft. Look at these shipping manifests. The stolen vehicles are just cover for something bigger. The manifests showed regular shipments moving through multiple ports, documentation too perfect to be legitimate. Weapons, Mike concluded. Using the stolen car operation to mask arms trafficking. Explains why he's moving so aggressively here, Reynolds said, entering the office. Pine Valley's location is perfect, close to major highways, access to shipping routes, small enough to control local law enforcement. Mike's store surveillance pinged, showing 2 Iron Scorpions members photographing his building. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. They're getting bolder, he observed, but sloppy, overconfident. Because they think they've got it all figured out, Chen replied. Local cops bought off, businesses intimidated, clear supply routes established. They don't realize we're building a case. Mike pulled up his own intelligence files, detailed notes on Iron Scorpion movements, patterns he'd observed, connections he'd mapped. Combined with Reynolds's surveillance and Chen's official reports, a clear picture of Cross's operation emerged. Look at this, Reynolds pointed to a property record. The old mill where Cross is meeting tonight? Purchased 6 months ago by another shell company. But trace the ownership. He laid out more documents. Links back to a former military contractor, someone Cross worked with overseas. Mike's expression hardened. He recognized the contractor's name. They'd crossed paths during his final deployment, an operation that had gone badly wrong. This isn't just about criminal enterprise, he said quietly. Cross is building something bigger. Military precision, international connections, weapons trafficking disguised as auto theft. You think he's supplying arms? Chen asked. Not just supplying, training. Look at how he's organizing the Iron Scorpions. Military structure, tactical training, strategic territory control. He's not building a gang, he's building an army. The implications sank in. Cross wasn't just another criminal trying to control territory. He was using Pine Valley as a test run for something larger, combining criminal networks with military expertise to create something more dangerous. Mike's phone buzzed again. Jim Chen reporting unusual activity at the pharmacy. Multiple Iron Scorpions members asking about storage space, delivery schedules, back entrance access. They're mapping the whole town, Mike noted. Every business, every route, every potential resource. Reynolds studied the surveillance feeds. Tonight's meeting is key. Cross wouldn't come personally unless something big was happening. We need eyes on that mill. Already handled, Mike replied, pulling up building plans. Tom's crew did some maintenance work there yesterday. Planted cameras, listening devices. We'll have eyes and ears on everything. Chen looked impressed. You've been busy, but Cross will have security, counter-surveillance measures. He'll be looking for official surveillance, law enforcement techniques, Mike explained. Not improvised equipment installed by auto mechanics. Sometimes the best technology is the stuff nobody thinks to look for. An alert pinged on his computer. More Iron Scorpions arriving in town, these ones moving with military precision. Not local chapters, but professional operators wearing gang colors as cover. Cross is bringing in his real muscle, Reynolds observed. These aren't ordinary gang members. Look at their movement patterns, their situational awareness, ex-military, Probably private contractors. Mike nodded, remembering similar operators from his deployment days. He's preparing for something. Tonight's meeting isn't just about failed robbery attempts or territory control. He's mobilizing. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture more complex and dangerous than a simple criminal enterprise. Cross wasn't just expanding his operation. He was using Pine Valley as a staging ground for something that would reach far beyond their small community. "We need to move carefully," Mike said, studying the intelligence they'd gathered. "Cross thinks he's hunting us, but he doesn't realize we've been tracking him all along. Tonight's meeting will tell us what he's really planning." As if to emphasize his point, another group of motorcycles roared past the store, their riders carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of combat veterans. The quiet shopkeeper watched them through his cameras, his expression unreadable. The real war was about to begin, and Pine Valley was ground zero. But this time, the quiet man behind the counter wasn't just defending his store. He was protecting his community from a threat few understood was coming. As night fell over Pine Valley, Mike's store became a hub of covert activity. In the basement storage room, now converted into an impromptu command center, he gathered with his core team. Reynolds had brought in two of his most trusted operatives, former Rangers like himself, who'd been tracking Cross's activities in Detroit. Detective Chen arrived with a trusted colleague from the county's organized crime unit. "Surveillance is in place," Tom reported, pulling up feeds from the cameras his team had planted around the old steel mill. "Got eyes on every entrance. Directional mics covering the main meeting areas. Signals being routed through 3 different relays to mask our location." Mike nodded approvingly. The old mechanic might look like a simple auto shop owner, but he'd revealed a surprising talent for technical improvisation. Mrs. Martinez's network. 8 shops reporting Iron Scorpion movements, Chen answered, marking positions on their tactical map. "They're establishing a perimeter around the industrial district. Professional work. Overlapping fields of observation. Coordinated patrol patterns." "Like they're expecting trouble," Reynolds added, studying the pattern. "These aren't regular gang tactics. This is military-grade security deployment." Mike's phone buzzed with updates from their growing network of observers. Jim Chen's delivery drivers reported suspicious vehicles at key intersections. The local taxi company, now part of their intelligence network, noted multiple out-of-town visitors being dropped at strategic locations. "Cross isn't taking any chances," one of Reynolds' operators noted. "Those aren't just lookouts. They're blocking positions, designed to control approach routes." "Because whatever's happening tonight is bigger than a simple gang meeting," Mike replied, pulling up more surveillance footage. "Look at who's arriving." The feeds showed a steady stream of vehicles, not just motorcycles, but expensive SUVs and luxury cars. The occupants moved with the distinctive bearing of professional operators trying to look casual. "I recognize some of these faces," Reynolds said grimly. "Former contractors, mercenaries, guys who worked high-risk security operations overseas. Cross is bringing in serious muscle." Chen's police scanner crackled with activity. All units being redirected to a supposed gang activity report on the other side of town. Again. "Clearing the area," Mike noted. "Standard operating procedure. But they're being obvious about it, which means they want us to know they control local law enforcement," Reynolds finished, sending a message. Mike's network had grown more sophisticated than Cross could imagine. The quiet shopkeeper had spent his military career learning how to build intelligence networks in hostile territory, and those skills were proving invaluable now. Mrs. Martinez's flower delivery van, now equipped with concealed cameras, made regular passes by key locations, documenting security positions. Tom's tow trucks, responding to strategically called-in breakdowns, provided mobile surveillance platforms. Even the local pizza delivery drivers had been recruited, their routine movements perfect cover for observing Iron Scorpion activities. "Latest from our friends at County Records," Chen reported, spreading out new documents. "Cross's shell companies have been busy. 4 more property purchases this week, all strategic locations, storage facilities, abandoned industrial sites, transportation hubs. Building infrastructure," Mike observed. "Not just for auto theft or weapons trafficking. This is about establishing long-term control of territory." Reynolds' phone buzzed. My contact at the Port Authority just confirmed. 3 ships registered to known cross-front companies scheduled to dock next week. Official cargo manifests show used vehicles for export. Perfect cover for moving weapons, Mike noted. Load them into high-end stolen cars, ship them out with clean paperwork. Anyone inspecting just sees luxury vehicles being exported. The basement door opened as Jim Chen entered, looking nervous but determined. Just had 3 more Iron Scorpions in the pharmacy. They were asking about our storage capacity, delivery schedules. But they slipped up. One of them mentioned something about staging areas and distribution networks. Mike added this information to their growing intelligence map. Cross wasn't just expanding his criminal enterprise, he was establishing a sophisticated logistics network, using legitimate businesses as cover for something much larger. "We need to get ears inside that meeting," Reynolds said, checking his watch. "Cross will be arriving soon." "Already handled," Mike replied, activating another surveillance feed. Tom's crew didn't just plant cameras. Remember that delivery of vending machines to the mill last week? The feed showed crystal-clear audio from inside the mill's main office. Tom grinned. "Amazing what you can hide in a soda machine these days." "Multiple vehicles approaching," one of Reynolds' operators reported. "High-end SUVs, professional security formation. Has to be Cross." Mike studied the feeds, his expression focused. Years of military intelligence work had taught him that information was power, but timing was everything. They needed to know Cross's real plans before they could move against him effectively. "Everyone knows their roles," he said, addressing the assembled team. "We observe, we document, we build our case. Cross thinks he's establishing his operation in secret, but every move he makes adds to our intelligence." The quiet shopkeeper had spent 3 years building a peaceful life in Pine Valley. Now he was building something else, a network of ordinary citizens turned intelligence operatives, working together to protect their community from a threat few understood was coming. As Cross's convoy approached the mill, Mike allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best weapon isn't a gun or a knife, it's information, carefully gathered and properly used. And tonight they were about to gather quite a lot of it. The old steel mill buzzed with activity as Marcus Cross's security detail swept the premises. Through the surveillance feeds, Mike and his team watched the operation with professional appreciation. Cross's men moved with military precision, checking sight lines, establishing perimeters, sweeping for surveillance devices. They missed the vending machine, Tom noted with quiet satisfaction as the security team completed their sweep. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight. Cross arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, his presence commanding immediate attention. Mike studied the man through the cameras, mid-50s, expensive suit, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone used to absolute authority. But it was the subtle details that told the real story. The way he scanned rooms automatically, how he positioned himself with clear views of exits, the slight bulge of a concealed weapon under his jacket. "Definitely ex-military," Reynolds murmured. "Special forces, probably. Look at how his security team coordinates with him. They've worked together before in combat situations." The audio feed crackled to life as Cross addressed the assembled Iron Scorpion's leadership. "Last week's incident at the store was unacceptable." His voice carried the cold edge of controlled anger. "One shopkeeper embarrassed 3 of our people. Made us look weak." Mike's surveillance network reported increased Iron Scorpion movement throughout Pine Valley. They were establishing blocking positions, cutting off potential approach routes to the mill. Professional work, but it revealed their priorities. They were looking outward, expecting threats to come from outside. "The Pine Valley operation is too important to our plans," Cross continued. "This territory gives us everything we need: strategic location, compromised law enforcement, established transportation routes. We're not letting one ex-Marine disrupt years of planning." Chen's police scanner crackled with coded messages. Local police units being redirected away from the industrial district. "They're creating a dead zone," she observed. "No official response if anything happens." "Because something is about to happen," Mike replied, noting subtle changes in the Iron Scorpion's patrol patterns. They were tightening their perimeter, preparing for action. Cross's next words confirmed it. "I want that store hit tonight. Full force. Make an example. Show everyone in Pine Valley what happens when someone defies us." He turned to a hard-faced man in tactical gear. "Carter, take your team. Do it right." Mike's expression remained calm as he watched Carter, another ex-military operator, select his assault team. This was the moment they'd been waiting for. "Reynolds." "My people are in position," Reynolds confirmed. "County SWAT too, waiting outside town limits. They'll move as soon as we give them probable cause." The pieces were in place. Mike had known Cross wouldn't be able to let the store incident go unanswered. Professional pride and tactical necessity would demand a response. Now that response would become Cross's undoing. "They're moving," Chen reported, watching Carter's team load up. 8 operators, full tactical gear. They're not trying to be subtle anymore. Mike nodded to Reynolds, who activated his radio. "All units execute Operation Spotlight." Across Pine Valley, carefully prepared positions came to life. Mrs. Martinez's flower van, parked strategically, captured high-resolution video of Carter's team loading illegal automatic weapons. Tom's hidden cameras recorded Cross giving explicit orders for the assault. Jim Chen's pharmacy cameras documented Iron Scorpions establishing blocking positions, proving coordination. "Remember," Mike addressed his team, "we're not just defending the store, we're documenting everything, building a case that even corrupt officials can't ignore." Carter's assault team moved with professional precision, approaching the store from multiple angles. They found it dark, apparently closed early, exactly as planned. What they didn't realize was that every approach was being recorded from multiple angles, every movement documented as evidence. "Federal task force standing by," Chen reported, monitoring encrypted communications. "They'll move as soon as the assault team breaches." The next few minutes unfolded exactly as Mike had anticipated. Carter's team, believing they had overwhelming force and surprise, breached the store's front entrance with tactical efficiency. They found themselves in a carefully prepared kill box of evidence gathering, multiple cameras capturing their illegal weapons, their coordinated assault, their clear intent to do harm. "Now," Mike ordered. Simultaneously, multiple forces converged. Reynolds' operators and county SWAT teams moved to cut off escape routes. Federal agents, armed with probable cause and documented evidence of organized crime, launched coordinated raids on Iron Scorpion positions throughout Pine Valley. At the mill, Cross realized too late that he'd walked into a trap. His supposedly secure meeting had been recorded, his explicit orders to attack the store documented from multiple angles. The evidence was already being uploaded to secure servers, beyond the reach of corrupt local officials. "Beautiful," Reynolds commented as they watched the operation unfold. "Cross thought he was organizing an assault on a store. Instead, he handed us everything we needed to take down his entire operation." The federal task force hit the mill with overwhelming force, catching Cross and his leadership with illegal weapons, documented evidence of criminal conspiracy, and recorded orders for violent action. His carefully constructed network of corruption and intimidation began to unravel as arrests were made throughout Pine Valley. Mike watched through his surveillance feeds as Carter's assault team was taken into custody, their military-grade weapons providing irrefutable evidence of Cross's weapons trafficking operation. Sometimes the best victory isn't won through direct confrontation, but by letting your opponent's own actions become their downfall. "Think they'll finally understand?" Chen asked, watching federal agents lead Cross away in handcuffs. "About underestimating quiet shopkeepers?" Mike allowed himself a small smile. "They might, but more importantly, Pine Valley is safer now. Sometimes the biggest victories come from simply protecting what matters." The quiet shopkeeper had turned his store into a trap, using Cross's own tactics and pride against him. It was a lesson the criminal underworld wouldn't soon forget. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one making threats, but the one quietly waiting for you to make a mistake. The aftermath of Cross's arrest rippled through Pine Valley like shockwaves. While federal agents processed evidence from the steel mill raid, Mike's network reported increased activity among the remaining Iron Scorpions. Those who'd escaped the initial sweep were regrouping, and something about their movements concerned him. "They're not running," Mike observed, studying surveillance feeds from across town. "They're reorganizing. Too quickly. Too efficiently." Reynolds leaned over the tactical display in the store's basement command center. "Because Cross had contingency plans. Look at their pattern. They're falling back to secondary positions, establishing new communication networks. This was prepared in advance." Detective Chen rushed in, her expression grave. "Just got word from the federal task force. Cross is talking, but he's smiling too much, says we have no idea what's really coming." Mike's phone buzzed with urgent updates from his community network. Mrs. Martinez reported suspicious vehicles moving through residential areas. Tom's mechanics noted increased activity at several warehouses supposedly seized in the raid. Jim Chen's pharmacy staff documented unfamiliar faces, asking unusual questions about medical supplies. "They're not just regrouping," Mike realized, connecting the patterns. "They're initiating something. Cross's arrest wasn't a setback. It was a trigger." As if confirming his assessment, multiple alerts hit their surveillance system. Across Pine Valley, previously dormant locations suddenly swarmed with activity. Storage units rented under false names were being emptied. Vehicles with hidden compartments moved in coordinated patterns. New faces appeared, moving with military precision while trying to look casual. "These aren't just gang members," Reynolds noted, studying camera footage. "Look at their movement patterns, their equipment. More. Contractors, professional operators." Cross wasn't just building a criminal enterprise, he was assembling an army. Chen's police scanner erupted with activity. Reports flooded in. Break-ins at strategic locations, mysterious fires at key infrastructure points, coordinated attacks on security systems. The pattern was clear: systematic disruption of community resources. "They're destabilizing the town," Mike explained, recognizing the tactics from his military days. "Create chaos, overwhelm emergency services, make people feel vulnerable, then offer protection, establish control." His phone rang, Tom calling from the auto shop. "Mike, you need to see this. Just had a group of customers come in. They weren't subtle about suggesting we might need their help handling insurance matters. Said things are about to get complicated in Pine Valley." Similar reports came in from other businesses. The Iron Scorpions weren't just threatening, they were offering protection from the very chaos they were creating. It was sophisticated psychological warfare, targeting a community's sense of security. Cross planned this, Reynolds concluded. The arrest, the power vacuum, the coordinated destabilization. He's showing Pine Valley what happens when his protection is removed. Mike studied the tactical map, now lit up with incident reports. The pattern wasn't random. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign to break community resistance. Each incident was designed to create maximum psychological impact while minimizing actual evidence of criminal activity. "They're learning from our tactics," he noted. "No direct confrontations, no easily documented crimes. They're using fear itself as a weapon." Chen's phone buzzed with updates from the federal investigation. "Cross's organization is bigger than we thought. International connections, military contracts, political protection. The Pine Valley operation was just one piece of a larger network." "And now that network is mobilizing," Reynolds added. "These aren't just local gangsters anymore. We're facing professional operators with military training and serious backing." Mike's surveillance system pinged with new alerts. More vehicles entering Pine Valley, expensive SUVs, tactical equipment disguised as commercial cargo, communications gear hidden in ordinary delivery trucks. The Iron Scorpions weren't just replacing their losses, they were upgrading their capabilities. "They think they've learned from their mistakes," Mike observed, watching the operation unfold. "No more amateur intimidation attempts, no direct attacks that could be easily documented. They're going to strangle the town slowly, professionally." His network continued reporting. Businesses finding their suppliers mysteriously unreliable, banking transactions inexplicably delayed, routine services becoming problematic. The Iron Scorpions were weaponizing everyday inconveniences, making normal life gradually more difficult. "What's our move?" Chen asked, watching another incident report light up the tactical display. "We can't arrest people for making deliveries late or offering insurance services." Mike's expression hardened as he studied the patterns. He recognized these tactics. He'd seen them used in conflict zones around the world. The quiet shopkeeper had spent years fighting exactly this kind of sophisticated psychological warfare. "They think they're being clever," he said finally, "using our own tactics against us, avoiding direct confrontation. But they've made two critical mistakes." "Yeah? What's that?" Reynolds asked. "First, they still think they're dealing with ordinary civilians. They don't realize that every business owner in Pine Valley is now part of an intelligence network that's been training for exactly this scenario." "And the second mistake?" Chen prompted. Mike allowed himself a small, dangerous smile. "They forgot that some quiet shopkeepers know exactly how to fight this kind of shadow war. Cross thinks he's clever, hiding behind proxies and psychological operations. But he's about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who's seen all these tactics before." The quiet shopkeeper turned to his assembled team, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd fought this kind of battle before. "They want to play a shadow war? Fine. Let's show them how it's really done." The real fight for Pine Valley was about to begin, and this time, it would be fought in the shadows where some quiet shopkeepers were most dangerous of all. The basement command center hummed with activity as Mike briefed his expanded team. Reynolds' operators had set up advanced surveillance equipment, while Chen coordinated with trusted law enforcement units. The community network leaders, Tom, Mrs. Martinez, Jim Chen, and others, gathered around the tactical display. Cross's organization is implementing a three-phase strategy to map patterns of activity. First, create controlled chaos to demonstrate why the community needs their protection. Second, establish themselves as the only solution to the problems they're creating. Third, leverage that position to take control of legitimate businesses and infrastructure. Classic insurgency tactics, Reynolds noted. "We saw similar patterns in private security operations overseas." Mike nodded. "Exactly, but they're not fighting untrained civilians anymore. Every business owner in this room has spent weeks preparing for exactly this scenario." He pulled up detailed plans on the main screen. The quiet shopkeeper had been training his network, teaching them counter-surveillance techniques, establishing secure communication protocols, preparing for this escalation. "Mrs. Martinez," Mike turned to the flower shop owner, "your delivery network is our eyes and ears. Your drivers know every street, every alley. They can spot surveillance teams trying to blend in." She smiled confidently. "My people are ready. We've memorized their patrol patterns, identified their observation posts. They think we're just making deliveries." "Tom," Mike continued, "your mechanics have been documenting every vehicle they're using. Serial numbers, hidden modifications, unusual equipment." "Got better than that," the old mechanic grinned. "Remember those routine maintenance calls we've been getting from their front companies? Every vehicle we serviced got tagged with hidden trackers. We can monitor their movements across the entire county." Mike turned to Jim Chen. "The pharmacy network? All the local medical facilities are coordinating," Jim reported. "Any unusual purchases, suspicious prescriptions, or medical supplies that could support their operations, we're tracking it all. Plus, our delivery schedules give us perfect cover for monitoring their safe houses." Detective Chen added her update. "County task force is ready. They're positioning units outside town, waiting for our signal. And our federal contacts are monitoring Cross's known associates. Any major players coming to town will know." Mike studied the tactical map, now marked with overlapping layers of surveillance coverage. The Iron Scorpions thought they were being clever, using subtle intimidation and psychological warfare. They didn't realize every move they made was being watched, documented, and analyzed by a sophisticated counterintelligence network. "They'll make their big push soon," Reynolds predicted. "Our sources say they're bringing in additional operators, setting up command and control infrastructure." "Let them come," Mike replied calmly. "Every piece of equipment they bring in, every safe house they establish, every operator they deploy, it all adds to our evidence. We're not just defending anymore. We're building a case that will take down their entire network." His phone buzzed with updates from the community network. New vehicles entering town. suspicious activity at warehouse locations, unusual patterns in local business transactions. Each piece of information was another thread in the web they were weaving around Cross's organization. "Remember," Mike addressed the group, "they expect resistance from law enforcement, from rival gangs, from traditional opposition. They're not looking for a network of ordinary citizens who've been trained in counterintelligence techniques." He pulled up surveillance photos showing Iron Scorpion operators conducting their own reconnaissance. "They think they're hunting us. They don't realize they're walking into a trap 3 months in the making." "What's our timeline?" Chen asked, checking updates from her federal contacts. "Their main force arrives tomorrow night," Mike replied. "We let them set up their operation, establish their presence, let them think they're in control. Then," he activated another display, showing coordinated response plans. Every business in the network had its role. Every citizen-turned-operative knew their part. The quiet shopkeeper had turned Pine Valley itself into an elaborate snare. "This isn't just about protecting one town anymore," Mike continued. "Cross's organization has similar operations in other communities. We take them down here. We create a template for fighting back everywhere." Reynolds studied the plans with professional appreciation. "You're not just preparing for defense. You're getting ready to dismantle their entire operation." Mike allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy think they're winning, right up until the moment they realize they've already lost. The team spent the next hours finalizing preparations. Communication protocols were verified, surveillance positions confirmed, response teams readied. Every detail was checked and double-checked, every contingency planned for. As the others left to take their positions, Chen lingered. "You knew this was coming, didn't you? Even before the first Iron Scorpions walked into your store. You've been preparing for this kind of fight." Mike looked around his store, no longer just a business, but the command center for an operation that would decide Pine Valley's future. "Let's just say some habits are hard to break. Cross thinks he's facing a shopkeeper who got lucky against a few amateur thugs. He's about to learn why you should always look carefully at the quiet ones." Outside, Pine Valley settled into an uneasy night. Tomorrow would bring Cross's reinforcements, their attempt to take control of the town. But this time, they weren't facing unorganized resistance or unprepared civilians. They were about to confront a network of ordinary citizens turned intelligence operatives, led by a quiet shopkeeper, who'd spent years mastering exactly this kind of warfare. The final battle for Pine Valley was about to begin, and it would be fought in ways the Iron Scorpions never expected. The next evening unfolded exactly as Mike had predicted. Iron Scorpion reinforcements rolled into Pine Valley in waves, their arrival carefully choreographed to avoid attention. Professional operators established command posts, surveillance positions, and control points throughout the town. They thought they were being subtle. They didn't realize every move was being documented by an invisible network of observers. "Main force is in position," Reynolds reported from his observation post, counting at least 40 operators, military-grade equipment, sophisticated communications gear. "They're setting up for something big." Mike watched through his store's surveillance system as teams of Iron Scorpions began their coordinated operation. They moved with professional precision, implementing textbook urban control tactics. Each team had its assigned sector, each movement carefully planned to demonstrate their power while maintaining deniability. "They're starting their show of force," Chen reported via secure channel, getting calls about accidents at businesses that resisted them. Power outages, delivery problems, mysterious equipment failures. But this time, Pine Valley was ready. Every incident was captured on hidden cameras, every threat recorded, every act of intimidation documented from multiple angles. The quiet shopkeepers network had turned the entire town into an evidence-gathering operation. "All teams in position," Mike confirmed, watching his tactical display. "Time to show them why you don't underestimate small communities." The counter-operation began subtly. Mrs. Martinez's flower delivery vans, each equipped with sophisticated surveillance gear, conducted their regular routes. They mapped the Iron Scorpions' positions, identified their command posts, and documented their operators' movements. Tom's mechanics, responding to strategic breakdown calls, planted tracking devices on key vehicles. Jim Chen's pharmacy network monitored suspicious purchases and medical supply requests, building a pattern of the organization's activities. The Iron Scorpions thought they were establishing control. Instead, they were walking into an elaborate trap, every move adding to the evidence being gathered against them. Federal task force standing by, Chen reported. They've got teams positioned outside town waiting for our signal. Mike watched as the Iron Scorpions' operation reached its peak. Their leaders gathered for a coordination meeting in what they thought was a secure location, actually a building wired with surveillance equipment during its recent renovation. Execute final phase, Mike ordered. Across Pine Valley, carefully prepared positions came alive. Reynolds's operators and trusted law enforcement units moved to cut off escape routes. The citizen network activated, each business owner implementing their part of the plan. The Iron Scorpions found their communications mysteriously jammed, their escape routes blocked by coincidental roadwork, their vehicles suddenly disabled by mechanical problems that Tom's mechanics had quietly arranged during routine maintenance. They're realizing something's wrong, Reynolds reported with professional satisfaction. But they can't figure out how they lost control so quickly. Mike allowed himself a small smile as he watched the operation unfold on his tactical display. The Iron Scorpions had thought they were facing unorganized resistance. Instead, they'd walked into a carefully orchestrated operation run by a former Force Recon Marine who'd spent years perfecting exactly this kind of warfare. Federal teams moving in, Chen announced. We've got documented evidence of RICO violations, weapons trafficking, organized criminal conspiracy. Their whole network is exposed. The raid was swift and decisive. Iron Scorpion operators found themselves caught in carefully prepared kill zones, not with weapons, but with overwhelming evidence of their crimes. Every attempt at intimidation, every act of corruption, every illegal operation had been recorded and documented. Their leadership, gathered in their supposedly secure meeting, was caught discussing their entire operation on high-quality surveillance audio. The evidence was damning, their methods exposed, their network laid bare. Cross's organization is finished, Reynolds confirmed as federal agents led away groups of handcuffed operators. Not just here, but in every community where they had operations, the evidence we gathered exposed their entire network. Mike watched through his store's cameras as Pine Valley emerged from the shadow of fear. Community members who'd been trained as intelligence gatherers returned to being simple business owners. The network that had brought down a criminal empire became invisible once again. Think they'll ever figure it out? Chen asked, watching the last Iron Scorpions being taken into custody. How a bunch of ordinary citizens managed to outmaneuver professional criminals? Probably not, Mike replied. They made the same mistake criminals always make, thinking that quiet people are weak people, that small communities are easy targets. The quiet shopkeeper looked around his store, now returning to its simple appearance as a neighborhood convenience store. The sophisticated command center in the basement would be dismantled, the surveillance equipment concealed, the tactical displays hidden away. But the network would remain, invisible, but ready. The citizens of Pine Valley had learned valuable lessons about protecting their community, about standing together against those who would prey on them. You know they'll try again, Reynolds warned as they conducted final checks of the area. Maybe not the Iron Scorpions, but someone else. There's always another criminal organization looking for territory. Mike nodded, already thinking ahead. And when they come, they'll find the same thing. A community that looks ordinary on the surface, but knows exactly how to defend itself. Sometimes the best victories are the ones your enemies never see coming. The quiet shopkeeper returned to his regular routine, serving customers, stocking shelves, maintaining his careful watch over his community. To anyone looking in, he was just another small business owner going about his day, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Because sometimes the most effective protector is the one nobody suspects. The quiet man behind the counter, ready to remind the next group of criminals why you should always look twice at peaceful communities and their unassuming defenders. Here's part 14. Theme reinforcement and conclusion. Approximately 950 words. 6 months after the fall of the Iron Scorpions, Pine Valley had returned to its quiet routine. Mike's store continued its daily business, looking just like any other neighborhood convenience store. The sophisticated surveillance equipment remained hidden. The basement command center mothballed but maintained, ready if ever needed again. Detective Chen stopped by one morning for her usual coffee. "Heard some interesting news," she said casually, leaning against the counter. 3 other towns successfully disrupted criminal operations using what they're calling the Pine Valley method. Seems our quiet little victory created a template. Mike nodded, restocking the cigarette display with his usual methodical precision. The story of how a small community had outwitted a sophisticated criminal organization had spread through law enforcement channels, inspiring other towns facing similar threats. "Got something else you might find interesting?" Chen continued, sliding a file across the counter. "Remember those 3 iron scorpions who tried to rob your store that first night? They're talking to federal investigators. Seems being embarrassed by a shopkeeper was the best thing that ever happened to them." Mike reviewed the file. The 3 would-be robbers had turned state's evidence, providing valuable information about criminal operations in other communities. Their failed attempt at intimidation had inadvertently helped expose criminal networks across multiple states. Mrs. Martinez entered the store, carrying her usual offering of fresh empanadas. "You two talking about those other towns?" she asked, arranging the food on the counter. "My cousin in Oak Ridge says their community used our methods to drive out some gang trying to take over their neighborhood. Said it all started with some quiet business owner who taught them how to fight back smart." The bell chimed as Tom from the auto shop entered, followed by Jim Chen from the pharmacy. They'd maintained their informal network, keeping watch over their community, ready to respond if new threats emerged. "You know what the real victory was?" Tom said, helping himself to coffee. "Not just driving out the iron scorpions, but showing regular folks they don't have to be victims. That fighting back doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it's about being smarter than the people trying to intimidate you." Reynolds stopped by later that afternoon, looking as professional as ever in his security consultant role. "Cross's organization is completely dismantled," he reported. "The evidence we gathered exposed operations in 12 states. But here's the interesting part. Other criminal enterprises are actively avoiding small towns now. They're calling it the quiet shopkeeper effect." Mike allowed himself a small smile at that. The criminal underworld had learned an expensive lesson about underestimating peaceful communities and their unassuming defenders. "Got movement at the edge of town," Chen reported later that evening. "New group trying to establish presence, calling themselves the Desert Vipers." "Let them come," Mike replied calmly, watching through his carefully maintained surveillance network. "They'll either learn from history or repeat it." The quiet shopkeeper continued his daily routine, serving customers, maintaining his store, keeping his careful watch over the community. To anyone looking in, he was just another small business owner going about his day. But Pine Valley had changed in subtle ways. Business owners kept more careful records, installed better security systems, maintained closer communication with their neighbors. The community had learned valuable lessons about standing together, about fighting smart instead of fighting hard. "You know what I realized?" Mrs. Martinez said one quiet evening as the regulars gathered for their usual end-of-day coffee. "Those iron scorpions, they thought they were so clever with their military tactics and professional operators, but they never understood what they were really fighting." "What's that?" Chen asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "Community," Mrs. Martinez replied. "Not just people living in the same town, but people looking out for each other. All those fancy tactics don't mean much when every grandmother with a flower shop is part of an intelligence network." Mike listened to the conversation, thinking about how it had all started. 3 amateur criminals walking into the wrong store, underestimating the quiet man behind the counter. They'd never realized they were facing someone who'd spent years mastering the art of unconventional warfare, someone who knew that the best victories often come from careful preparation and patient observation. The sun set over Pine Valley, casting long shadows across the store's parking lot. Mike completed his closing routine, checking security systems that were far more sophisticated than any ordinary shop would need. The quiet shopkeeper had returned to his peaceful life but remained ready, watching, protecting his community in ways few would ever suspect. Because sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one making threats or displaying power. Sometimes it's the quiet one behind the counter, the unassuming protector who knows exactly how to defend what matters most. And if anyone else made the mistake of thinking Pine Valley was an easy target, they'd learn the same lesson the Iron Scorpions had learned, that you should always look twice at peaceful communities and their quiet defenders, because sometimes the most effective protector is the one nobody suspects, the one quietly waiting to remind the next group of criminals why you should never judge a book by its cover. The quiet shopkeeper turned off his store's lights, another ordinary day coming to an end in Pine Valley. But his careful watch continued, invisible but constant, ready to remind anyone who forgot that some quiet people are quiet for very good reasons indeed. Here's part 15. Epilogue and future setup. 950 words. 1 year after the Iron Scorpions' failed attempt to take over Pine Valley, Mike sat in his usual spot behind the counter, watching the morning sun rise over his quiet community. The store remained largely unchanged. Same neat shelves, same spotless floors, same carefully maintained sight lines to all entrances and exits. His phone buzzed with a message from Detective Chen. "You seeing the news?" Cross's final appeal denied. He's going away for good. A moment later, another message from Reynolds. Intelligence channels confirm criminal organizations are actively warning their people to avoid quiet towns with observant shopkeepers. Mike allowed himself a small smile as he continued his morning routine. The story of Pine Valley's resistance had become something of a legend in law enforcement circles. The quiet shopkeeper protocol was now being taught in police academies as a model for community-based crime prevention. Mrs. Martinez entered with her usual morning delivery of fresh empanadas. "Did you hear about Oak Ridge?" she asked, arranging the food. "Another gang tried moving in last week, found themselves facing an entire community that knew exactly how to fight back. Someone there must have read the Pine Valley playbook." Through his windows, Mike watched his community going about its daily business. On the surface, everything looked normal. Shops opening, people heading to work, the usual rhythm of small-town life. But subtle changes remained. Business owners maintained their careful observation habits. Neighbors watched out for each other with trained awareness. The invisible network stayed ready, just in case. Tom stopped by later that morning, ostensibly to check the store's security cameras. "Got an interesting call from my cousin in Millbrook," he said casually. "Their community's having some trouble with a new group moving in. Asked if I knew anyone who might be able to offer some tactical advice." Mike nodded thoughtfully. What had started as one quiet shopkeeper defending his store had evolved into something larger, a model for communities protecting themselves, a network of ordinary citizens who'd learned to fight back smart against those who would prey on them. "Remember those 3 who tried to rob you?" Chen asked, stopping by for her afternoon coffee. "They're working with the FBI now, teaching other communities how to spot early signs of criminal organizations moving in. Ironic, isn't it? Their biggest failure became their path to redemption." The bell chimed as Jim Chen entered, carrying his usual stack of local newspapers. "Look at this," he said, spreading them on the counter. Headlines from neighboring towns told similar stories, communities successfully resisting criminal encroachment, using methods that seemed remarkably familiar to anyone who knew Pine Valley's story. "You started something bigger than just defending one store," Reynolds observed during his weekly security consultation. "You showed people that fighting back doesn't always mean direct confrontation. Sometimes it's about being smarter, more organized, more patient than the people trying to intimidate you." As evening approached, Mike received another message from his expanded network. A small town 3 states over was facing similar problems to what Pine Valley had encountered. They were asking for guidance, for someone who understood how to turn ordinary citizens into an effective resistance force. "Planning a road trip?" Chen asked, noting Mike's thoughtful expression. "Maybe," he replied. "Some things are worth sharing. Some lessons need to be taught in person." The quiet shopkeeper looked around his store, still his sanctuary, but now also something more. It had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sometimes the most effective defense comes from the most unexpected sources. Outside, Pine Valley continued its peaceful existence. But beneath the surface, the community remained vigilant. The network Mike had built stayed active, evolving, ready to face whatever new threats might emerge. Other towns had learned from their example, creating their own networks, their own quiet defenders. You know what the Iron Scorpions never understood? Mrs. Martinez reflected during the evening gathering of regular customers. They thought they were just fighting one ex-Marine running a convenience store. They never realized they were actually facing an entire community that had learned how to defend itself. Mike listened to the conversations around him, thinking about how far they'd come. The failed robbery attempt that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. Now Pine Valley's methods were being replicated across the country, creating a network of communities that knew how to protect themselves. As night fell, Mike completed his closing routine, checking security systems that were far more sophisticated than any ordinary shop would need. The quiet shopkeeper had returned to his peaceful life, but remained ready, watching, protecting his community in ways few would ever suspect. Because sometimes the most effective protector isn't the one making threats or displaying power. Sometimes it's the quiet one behind the counter, the unassuming guardian who knows exactly how to defend what matters most. And if anyone else made the mistake of thinking small towns were easy targets, they'd learn the same lesson the Iron Scorpions had learned, that you should always look twice at peaceful communities and their quiet defenders. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one making threats. It's the one quietly waiting to remind the next group of criminals why you should never underestimate a shopkeeper who knows exactly how many steps it takes to reach you. The quiet shopkeeper turned off his store's lights. Another ordinary day ending in Pine Valley. But his watch continued, invisible but constant, ready to teach the next lesson about why some quiet people are quiet for very good reasons indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.